Jesus Christ. That's Jason Bourne.
At one time, that name produced chills, both within the characters of his world and with movie-going audiences. Back in the 2000s, Matt Damon lit up screens, and both Doug Liman and Paul Greengrass thrilled people with stories of US government conspiracies, all-out manhunts, and a man who is seeking to atone for his past sins. Each of the first three Bourne films became well-regarded examples of a more straightforward take on action films. Keep them lean, keep them simple, keep them direct. While there is a lot of noise surrounding each scene, it's easy to stay focused and in the moment. These three films, Identity in particular, were highly influential on action films to follow afterwards. However, their shadow was sometimes too large to overcome. While the emulation of Bourne style has become a bit cliched, there is something still intriguing about those first three films, despite us being about 20 years removed from them. I always knew I wanted to do something on this series, but I was indecisive on what form that should take. I could have kept it to a simple ranking list, much as I have done with Star Wars, Star Trek, or Tomb Raider. But I decided I wanted to do a more thorough retrospective like Indiana Jones, the Christopher Reeve Superman films, or Pirates of the Caribbean, since there are only 5 films to tackle. Unlike virtually everything else I've done so far on this channel, the Bourne series isn't one I know intimately. I watched the first 3 countless times in high school, though it has been years since I had rewatched any of them, and I've only seen Legacy a handful of times. So I will do my best to tackle them in my usual style, examining each and drawing conclusions to communicate whether I like a film or not, but I won't pretend to be any more of an expert on the subject than I am. I've never even read the original Ludlum or Les Bader novels beyond some plot synopses, though to be fair, the movie series seems to be a totally different beast in its story and use of characters that I'm not sure a familiarity with the books is required to properly review them. I would go so far as to say that each of the credits should say suggested by rather than based on. Saying these films are based on those stories would be like saying a meatball marinara sandwich is the same thing as a pizza. You could technically make an argument for it, but you'd be ignoring some hard facts in order to make your point. Anyway, let's begin. Released in 2002, the Bourne Identity was probably expected to be just one more on the list of spy thriller films that year, and there were quite a few. Dine of the Day, Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, Triple X, The Sum of All Fears, and Spy Kids 2 all came out that same year, not to mention a few spy comedies like I Spy, Undercover Brother, and even Austin Powers and Goldmember. Plus, it was supposed to be based on a so-called airport novel written in 1980 and starred Matt Damon, who most people at the time still associated with the math genius protagonist from Good Will Hunting from 5 years earlier. Its director, Doug Liman, was only really known for indie comedies like Swingers and had never done a big-budget action film before. It was an unlikely combination that nobody expected much from. However, upon release, it proved to be a pioneer for action films in a way that seemed counterintuitive at the time. Just do an action film that had no flights of fancy about its importance or an over-the-top presentation of its action, with a focus on a character's emotional journey. Instead of trying to match films like The Matrix and James Bond in their bombastic manner and visuals, Identity focused on one man's journey to reclaim his past, and how it threatens a government black ops program. It was heralded as forward-thinking just for doing what it promised, and proving that spectacle was not the only way to go in trying to excite an audience. The film starts out with a man floating in the Mediterranean Sea during a storm. He is picked up by a local fishing boat and treated by their onboard doctor, who notices 2 gunshot wounds in his back and info for a bank account embedded in the back of his head. When the man wakes up, he showcases amnesia, not remembering anything before he was picked up, but demonstrating abilities he must have learned in his past, clues that hint to who he was. When he gets off the boat and arrives at the bank in Zurich, he discovers his name is Jason Bourne, and finds more evidence as to what he was doing before. At the same time, Alexander Conklin, head of a CIA program called Treadstone, is notified that Bourne has resurfaced. He begins a search for Jason and starts calling in assassins, worried that Bourne, unmonitored and uncontrolled, could be a threat to the existence of the program. The race is on. Can Bourne figure out his past before an operation with the backing of the world's most powerful government silences him for good? The Bourne Identity may seem like another dime a dozen thriller centering on a manhunt, but it has a surprising amount of meat to it. First up is the man himself, Jason Bourne. Someone who lost his identity seems like an icebreaker for a thrilling story, but it starts the character off at a bit of a disadvantage because right away, he presents us with little to latch onto or to care about. However, it's still a compelling hook because Jason himself acts as our eyes-in character for the first part of the movie. As we learn more about his past, we understand why Jason with a blank slate would be terrified about what he uncovers. Once Marie is introduced and becomes the audience surrogate for the second part, we are given a lifeline for a little longer to get used to this man and his history. By the third act, we know enough about Bourne and how he works that we can follow along without the need for more exposition or handholding. It's a smart way of guiding the audience through a story without treating us as simpletons. Most people walking into the film probably know that Bourne is a government agent and a pretty skilled one at that, but we are taken aback by how efficient and no-nonsense he is, and that's reflected in just about every aspect of the character. He walks with purpose, constantly observing his environment without being distracted, and his fights are generally short, since he tries to take down every person without fuss. It's like Robert Downey Jr.'s Sherlock Holmes without the slow-mo sequence that shows us every bit of the fight before its execution. This honestly makes for a fairly typical action hero, but what makes Bourne great is that he still feels like a human being. Each of the films includes something personal for us to latch onto, some character journey for Bourne that makes him want to get involved into the larger story. He's a character that wants his life to be simple, to be left alone and off the grid. However, something always brings him back in to drive the narrative. Sometimes it's his innate desire to uncover the truth, and at others, it's a personal quest about putting to rest the ghosts of his past. Identity is, understandably, about Bourne finding out his identity. While what is revealed is frightening to him, he is compelled to go on, knowing that something is very wrong and that what made him into this man must be laid bare. I always wonder how I would feel if I woke up one morning and remembered that I had a much more exciting and significant life. In the hands of a children's or teen book author, this would be a call to adventure, that grand opening of the door in the wardrobe to take us to some fantastical place. In real life, this would be far more complicated and maybe even a little bit terrifying. For Jason, finding out his past is a nightmare made real, and yet I can't help but be entranced by a man who goes in anyway. He personifies the Mark Twain quote about courage. Courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear. I do think Bourne is just as freaked out about his situation as Marie is, evidenced by his freak out with her in the car. Notwithstanding his personal inclinations, he trusts his instincts and keeps going, something I think we all wish we could do more often. I'm not saying that the Bourne series is the most drenched in character development, but it is there, and I think it's the reason people remember the early films fondly beyond the action and the atmosphere. Speaking of which, it's hard to picture this film without its neo-noir tendencies to just let the emotion of the moment take over. The Bourne films tend to be visceral. When I'm in a fight scene, my pulse is racing and I'm temporarily hyper-focused on the progression of the fight. When I'm in the computer rooms, I'm looking at every detail, trying to piece together what the government knows versus what I know. When Bourne is walking down the street not being hunted, I feel alone with my thoughts, able to take a breath. This is a testament to the production crew, figuring out how to coordinate their efforts carefully so that amidst the franticness of the moment, you can easily keep up with what's going on. I think Paul Greengrass did a phenomenal job with this in the later films, especially considering that camera work, which we'll touch on later. But those inclinations really started here with Doug Liman. I know the production was quite stressful due to Liman's control freak sensibilities, which understandably were born out of doing independent cinema. He would often take the camera into his own hands and constantly shoot and reshoot a scene until it was just right. This caused friction, perhaps more so than usual, but I do think this style led to a more engaging film. The Bourne films are not just another action series I can put on in the background when I'm doing dishes or cleaning the house. They demand my attention, and they generally reward me for that investment. It's still rather unique in the action genre to this day. It's probably a foregone conclusion then that I think the action still holds up today. That car chase through Paris is something else, and I've seen way too many films that try to copy this sequence, sometimes within the same city. There are also wonderfully suspenseful bits like Bourne's escape from the embassy, his fight with the assassin in the apartment, the showdown in the field with the professor, and the finale at the safe house. What's fun about these is that not all of the action scenes are balls-to-the-wall explosions or fast-paced shootouts. The showdown in the field is actually fairly quiet, relying on observation and blending in with the environment. Bourne's escape from the embassy isn't a gunfight. It's an actual escape from a man who tries to outrun an armed force. I love how this film runs through a spectrum of action scenes, not relying on any one trick to carry it through. It makes for a roller coaster ride in the best way. The film's supporting cast do a great job of helping to facilitate Jason's journey. Chris Cooper plays Conklin, a man who feels like an overworked professional that has no personal life of his own, and who is a mirror for Jason to contemplate how the government can be all-consuming in its agenda. He is the antagonist, but I don't feel the same dislike for him that I do with the later villains. One of them, Ward Abbott, gets some development here, which is a good lead-in for his part in the next film. Also, I love Brian Cox in just about everything I see him in, so I always smile when his name shows up in the credits for a film. Franca Potente brings a realism to Marie that I appreciate. I feel like I've known people like this, a loner who is permanently adrift herself, and while she'd love to trust someone, she can't bring herself to open up to just anyone. Much like Conklin, I can see some similarities between her and Bourne, and it helps to sell the idea of a romance between them. While in the moment it does feel like too obvious and typical an element to add, it does make sense when you think about it. And given that Bourne's personal life was a far bigger deal in the books, this feels like a nod to that. One of the fun things about the Bourne series for me is going back and realizing how many of these people I recognize from other projects. Julia Stiles plays Nikki Parsons, a minor character who will become more significant in future films. Clive Owen plays the Professor, a Treadstone assassin who delivers one of the best lines in the series. Walter Coggins, an actor that I've seen in quite a few films and who recently made a splash with his role in Fallout, plays a small role here. And Adewale Akinnuoye Agbaje plays Wombosi. Granted, not a big name actor, but one that I've seen more than a few times. The music is also noteworthy, though in a strange way I can't quite articulate. It's mostly subdued electronics with an orchestral overlay, which seems pretty standard. It's done by John Powell, a relatively new face to film still at this time. He came up through the Hans Zimmer school of soundtrack composition, and yet has managed to feel remarkably different from Zimmer. He's worked a lot in animation, on films like Shrek, Kung Fu Panda, and How to Train Your Dragon, which is praise enough. However, he also has the distinction of being the only composer for me to rival some of John Williams' own works within the Star Wars franchise, his score for Solo being an absolutely amazing experience. But beyond all that, his few themes for the Bourne series, which are reused in just about every movie, have stayed with me for a long time. I'm not entirely sure why, but whenever I hear that opening woodwind melody or the 8-note descent played on the strings in an action scene, I'm instantly transported back into Bourne's world. The final thing I want to comment on is the influence of the then political landscape in these films. That was always going to be evident with a story about corrupt CIA officials going after a highly trained assassin, and it's not like the Ludlum series wasn't already based on conspiracy theories and distrust of the government. But the first 3 films feel very post-9/11. Some of that could just be the methodology of tracking Bourne, hacking into camera systems, wiretapping phones, and the like. But I also think the story's attitude towards a government that forgets about the people they are supposed to protect is a product of this era. That attitude has morphed into something more complicated since then in the real world, but the base conviction is still there in most people. In the US, we kind of distrust our government officials just as a rule, and we still see plenty of cover-ups and political scandals being exposed on a regular basis. The Bourne series are politically charged films that, while they don't specifically focus on just making commentary, feel drenched in certain political views that make for a solid backbone to its story and action. The Bourne Identity is a fine film that feels like it's telling a complete story. There are certainly threads left open for sequels, but if this had been the only thing we ever got from this group, I'd be satisfied. That's one distinction about the Bourne series that I love. The first 2 films were not made with sequels in mind. They were just about exploring a character in a largely self-contained story and did their best to leave the audience content with where it ends. Of course, Ultimatum is the close of the arc, but I feel like both Identity and Supremacy do a good job at tying off enough story and character threads that I'm not left feeling like there's yet a missing chapter to tackle. Identity is not my favorite in the series, but it's a great start, and remains a fondly discussed piece in the development of the modern action film. Of course, when there is an unexpected hit, the studio is going to want to milk it and create some sequels, and what do you know, there are plenty of Bourne books after Identity, so this seemed to be a good idea. However, Universal had a major concern: Doug Liman. While some crew members tried to downplay the tension that was present on the set of Identity, the studio was not willing to work with Liman again after that, and so Paul Greengrass was hired to take over directing duties, based off of his stunning work on Bloody Sunday. Most everyone from Identity that had a role in Supremacy signed back on, along with some new faces. Joan Allen would play Pamela Landy, the CIA deputy director who would lead the hunt for Bourne, and Carl Urban would play the Russian assassin who would be on Bourne's heels for a good chunk of the story. The plot picks up 2 years after Identity. Jason Bourne is living with Marie in India, trying to stay off the grid and recover what he can of his past. He is tormented by nightmares surrounding his first assignment as an assassin, killing a Russian politician named Nevsky and his wife. However, Bourne spots a stranger who is out of place in town. His gut instincts tell him something is off, and he is proven right. The stranger is a Russian hitman who is after Bourne. Jason escapes, but Marie is shot and killed. Thinking that the assassin was part of a reborn Treadstone, Bourne retaliates by coming back to civilization in Naples, and is immediately targeted once again. Turns out he is being framed for the death of 2 CIA agents, and Landy will not let their deaths go unanswered for. And the hitman was hired by a third party meant to kill Bourne in order to prevent the truth from coming out. Bourne must clear his name, as well as quell the nightmares so that he can be allowed to go back into the shadows in peace. Supremacy's story builds on top of Identity in a natural way. Now that Bourne has accepted who he is, he seeks to repent of his sins. The whole story may seem a little convenient, in that Landy is after some files about the Nevsky murders and Bourne just happens to also be seeking to make amends for that same act. But I like that the films are depicting a sincere transformation. Generally, it's accepted that to be forgiven of your sins, you must first admit to yourself and the other party that what you did was wrong, make a conscious choice to change, make restitution where possible, and demonstrate through your actions that you are a changed person. This is part of that deeper character journey that I feel endears the original Bourne trilogy to audiences. They are more than just visual thrill rides. They are actually telling a story about a man crawling back from the pit of hell into the light. But how can you do that when your life seems tainted by those dark acts that put you in hell? The films don't answer that definitively, but Bourne tries anyway, and I love seeing some thoughtful character progression in a series like this. The positives of Identity carry over here. Matt Damon continues to ground Bourne and make him as believable as possible. Franca Potente doesn't get a lot to do, but her small performance does stay with you, and she's never really forgotten in this story. Brian Cox does a wonderful job here. Abbott was more of a background figure for Conklin to talk to in the last film. Here he gets promoted to an actual prominent role, being the true villain of the piece. I love his talks with Landy and how you can see a desperate man trying to cover his tracks. By the time of his suicide, you can see him coming apart, and Cox does a great job depicting this journey. Joan Allen understands the role of Landy well. She's a very experienced officer who is effective and dedicated at her job, but she does have a certain untested nobility about her. That sense of hopefulness leads her away from being as corrupted as Abbott is, and thus she is more likely to handle her job in a reasonable way. Julia Stiles gets some stuff to do, and it's here that she starts to become a more prominent figure in the series. That scene with Bourne holding her at gunpoint is one of the most tense parts of the film. Finally, Carl Urban is pretty great in everything I've ever seen him in, and while this isn't a deep part, you feel like this is a well thought out role that Urban put a lot of work into. Paul Greengrass certainly takes his cue from Liman in directing, but there are some key differences. While Liman had a good sense of where to place the camera in order to accentuate the visual storytelling, Greengrass seems like a master at work. If you actually pay attention to his camera placement, you'll notice that you are only shown exactly what you need to see. Particularly in Ultimatum, it's kind of freaky to me that even in scenes with a horde of people, I can always see where the key player is in the shot, and that there aren't a lot of shots in which I'm questioning their purpose. That takes great skill and coordination between all departments to make this happen, and I applaud Greengrass for that. But let's talk about the issue I've been dancing around for a bit. The editing and camera movement. Greengrass wanted the camera to feel like it was part of the experience, and so there's a lot of shaky cam, making it feel like the cameraman is playing catch-up with the performers. This is especially evident in some of the action scenes, though even some of the dialogue-heavy scenes feature this same shakiness. But also the editing style is really quick. Sometimes we may only have a fraction of a second to get our bearings so we can follow along with what's going on. And by the way, the average shot length in this film was calculated to be 1.9 seconds. This is why I praise Greengrass's ability to be thoughtful in his shot composition. However, this style does get to be a bit much. If you are prone to motion sickness, these films can be incredibly difficult to watch, and even if you're not, you need to keep your eyes on the screen at almost all times to follow along with the fight and hunt sequences. This is why I said these films are not like typical action films where I can just leave them on in the background. So much information is conveyed through these scenes in a short amount of time, and there's so much quick cutting that looking down at my phone occasionally is actually very dangerous if my goal is to watch the film and absorb the story. This is the only thing that, unfortunately, a lot of action series seem to take from Bourne. Instead of studying the character's journey or really paying attention to Greengrass's style, they do the quick editing and shaky cam in a more grounded world in an attempt to superficially inject excitement into their films. This serves as a detriment to the genre as a whole, as it's like the kid who does one cool thing with their project that impresses the teacher, and now everyone is scrambling to copy what they did. It's not a thought-out artistic choice, it's one seemingly made out of desperation to catch up to the leader of the pack. Take a look at the Taken films, Quantum of Solace, or Batman Begins, and you'll see this in action. Those films have their merits, but one of the most resounding criticisms was that they took the same handheld camera and editing style and applied it without much consideration. Now, this is nothing new. Hollywood has always looked at recent hits and tried taking their individual elements and throwing them at a dartboard to see what lands with audiences in an attempt to ride some new kind of craze. And it's unfortunate that almost every time this happens, the films that were the start of it become guilty by association when it inevitably dies off. While people tend to blame the entire Bourne series for ruining late 2000s action films, it's a shame because I would say Supremacy and Ultimatum are the ones that most understand how to do these techniques in order to achieve their goals, and they still receive a lot of flack for simply featuring this style. There's a lot of good action scenes here too. We have another car chase, though this one feels different to the Paris one because it starts out on foot, and it's a chase involving both the well-meaning police force and a determined assassin. The sniper scene with Bourne looking at Landy is one of the most iconic scenes in 2000s action films, and for good reason. It's so well constructed and tight, to the point where the actual phone call lasts less than 90 seconds from the time Landy's people start to trace the call. So cool. While the fight scene with Bourne and the Treadstone assassin is the beginning of the shaky cam woes for me, I love how it's staged, and I even like that it continues a small gag that plays throughout the trilogy. Bourne uses some mundane object as a weapon, and it's tied to writing. The first film features a pen, the second a newspaper, and the third a book. In the hands of a trained person, anything can become a weapon, and it's a small part of what's thrilling about these fight scenes. This film has some stretches in logic that leave me a little confused. If these make sense to you, let me know. First, even if the town in India is incredibly small and well connected, I still think it's a giant coincidence that Bourne just happens to see the assassin in town as he's going about his errands. Second, the movie portrays Bourne's memory as still being spotty at this point, so how does he know where to go to find Jarda, the other Treadstone operative? This is a bit strange to me that this particular gap in his memory would be filled, but he couldn't remember the larger things like the Nevsky murders or how he was recruited in the Treadstone. And third, the woman in Russia not only knows where the Nevsky girl moved to, but can even cite specific details? Wow, that's convenient. There's one other thing I wanted to point out, and that's how this story progresses towards its final scenes in the third act. In reality, there are 3 big plot strands going throughout the film, and I love how it closes off each one in particular order. Abbott is revealed to be the mastermind behind the frame job, which has the biggest impact on the outside world. We then deal with the other assassin, making it so that Bourne isn't immediately worried about his life being placed in jeopardy. And then we close on a quieter personal resolution between Bourne and Irina Nevsky, something that doesn't have much meaning to anyone else beyond them, with the very final scene only really having meaning for Bourne, at least as it's presented within the story of this film. I found this to be a smart way of wrapping up the story. I generally see action films close off the personal stories before getting to the big world-ending climax. This film goes the other way, leaving the most personal climax of the 3 being the last thing we ponder about while watching the film. And that helps fuel my theory that these films have more going on at their core than they're given credit for. The Bourne Supremacy stands to me as a sequel that's equal to its predecessor. There are clear differences between the two in terms of story and style, but I think Supremacy is just as interesting and exciting. It progresses Jason's character in a natural way, it's not repeating the same story, and it takes a chance and shakes up the status quo going forward, making the film feel significant within a larger story. Plus, it's evolving the series' style and refining the action sequences to be so tight that the film feels economical with its command of narrative and spectacle. And finally, like Identity, it feels like we've sufficiently closed off the story enough so that if we never got another film, few would be claiming that the series was left on a cliffhanger. Greengrass was given much of the praise, and it seemed like the production went a lot smoother. So, naturally, the question arose if there would be a third film. Based on how these first two films went down, the answer was an enthusiastic yes. When starting out on the third film, the creative team definitely had ideas about where they wanted to go. Writer Tony Gilroy, who had been heavily involved in the previous two films, said he wanted to take the idea of Bourne seeking atonement for his murders further, as he felt the previous film de-emphasized that more than it should have. Greengrass wanted to explore if Bourne was a killer at heart, or if he was made to be a killer. After writing an initial first draft, Gilroy left the project to work on his own feature, Michael Clayton. Despite Matt Damon not being too happy with the script and thinking it was unreadable, Universal greenlit the project and hired Scott C. Burns and George Nolfi, with an additional draft offered by Sir Tom Stoppard. Everything seemed to come together, and the Bourne Ultimatum was released in the summer of 2007, to rave reviews and the biggest box office numbers of the series. It also went on to be the only Bourne film to be awarded an Oscar. 3 of them, actually. Ultimatum picks up right where Supremacy left off. Jason Bourne is still evading the cops in Russia after the climactic car chase in the last film. He is ambushed by 2 police officers, subdues one, and holds the other at gunpoint. He decides not to kill him and goes back into hiding. Sometime later, a news reporter named Simon Ross learns about Treadstone and a new program called Blackbriar. The CIA decides to follow Ross so as to prevent the exposure of these programs. Bourne reads some of Ross's articles about Treadstone and calls to demand a meeting at Waterloo Station to find his source. Realizing very quickly that the CIA are on Ross's tail, he tries to get him to safety, but unfortunately Ross is killed by an assassin. Both Bourne and the CIA, led by Noah Vosen and a reluctant Pam Landy, figure out the source is Neil Daniels, who lives in Madrid. When Bourne arrives at the apartment, he finds Nikki Parsons, who was reassigned to work with Daniels and offers to help Bourne in his quest. Once again, the CIA chases Bourne in the interest of preventing a national security leak that would end their Black Ops programs, while Jason looks to do exactly that, while getting some closure about a binding choice he made to become the man who he is now. One of the great strengths of the Bourne Ultimatum is how it works as a potential final chapter. Not only does it pretty definitively wrap up any lingering questions we might have had about Treadstone and Blackbriar, it also examines the power of choice. In light of Greengrass's desire to examine who Bourne is at his core, the opening scene is crucial, suggesting that Jason is not a programmed machine without free will. He makes the choice to spare the Russian officer when most people might consider the kill an understandable one. The finale has him remembering that awful choice he made to kill without context, which made him Jason Bourne. Once he remembers that bit, he makes a final choice to turn his back on this life, leaving behind his assassin persona and exposing the very program that constructed it to the public. The film goes one better by having Bourne's last words be to Paz, another assassin who does just what his superiors tell him. He repeats the poignant last words of the professor from the first film. "Look at us. Look at what they make you give." This stops Paz, as it should. The people under the control of these government programs have become unthinking weapons. They've been stripped of their identities and lives, perhaps the most valuable thing we all own. They are told by these government officials that it is all in service of their country, yet they are told to go after American citizens and are slaves to the agendas of their overlords. In order to protect people's rights to life, they have theirs stripped. This may initially sound like a noble sacrifice, but by losing your humanity and perspective on what you are fighting for, you can easily be manipulated as a tool to serve the personal interests of someone else, and that someone else might not have their heart in the right place. It's a frightening prospect, and yet another bit of social commentary these films make on the loss of freedom at the expense of security, which is still a widely debated issue. Should safety be the priority, or should freedom? And how scary the ramifications of such a choice. This extra bit of depth is what pushes the Bourne Ultimatum from being just another great Bourne outing into being my favorite of the series. It's not just a great action movie, it's a movie that makes me think about my own life and consider what I would do when faced with these questions. Ultimatum has more in common with Supremacy than Identity in terms of production, but like how that film built upon the first, Ultimatum does a similar thing and offers us some pretty fantastic sequences. The whole scene at Waterloo Station with Bourne and Ross is one of my favorite action bits in cinema. I love the whole concept of Bourne having to talk a scared commoner through a tense situation, and that Ross's unwillingness to place his trust in Bourne has consequences. His run through the station not only gets the CIA's attention, it ends up revealing Bourne. The second time he runs, he is killed. It reminds us of how careful Bourne has to be during these situations and how close to death he flirts every time. The action in Tangiers is also really good, with my mind flashing back to the Living Daylights frequently, despite that sequence being much shorter. I also highly enjoy Bourne's infiltration of the CIA building in New York. Seeing him turn the tables on them and having the CIA agents play right into his hands is just stunning and grin-inducing. Finally, the climax is captivating. Not content with being just another car chase, the true ending features the man who inducted Bourne into the program, played spectacularly by the late Albert Finney. Here, finally, we get to see how Bourne came to be and the beginning of the long, dirty road he had to walk in order to get back home over these 3 films. The cast is still doing a spectacular job, though I must give a special shout out to Julia Stiles. The other 2 films never allowed Nikki to be a huge part of the story, and I still question the likelihood of her being reassigned to Daniels and coming into Bourne's path a 3rd time, but she provides invaluable help, and it's nice to pair her up with Jason since she has a better sense of how to escape danger than Ross at the beginning. Really, I could praise this entire cast. David Strathairn as Noah Vosen makes for one of my favorite antagonists in the series. I've already praised Albert Finney, and you can copy-paste my praise of Joan Allen from Supremacy here. But there are 3 other people I wanted to give a short mention to. Scott Glenn replaces Thomas Arana as the CIA director, though I think they're meant to be separate characters. Personally, I love me some Scott Glenn, so I'm glad to see him here. Paddy Considine plays Simon Ross. I wouldn't think much of this, except that thanks to House of the Dragon, I've only recently become aware of how great a character actor he can be. Finally, Marvel fans will recognize Daniel Bruhl, playing the brother of Marie that Bourne meets with in Paris. I've talked about Greengrass and his use of the camera already in Supremacy, but I do want to use a few examples from this film to illustrate my earlier points about his shot composition and how shaky cam is a problem occasionally. During the Waterloo sequence, there are a few quick shots of Ross running through the station, giving away his position, and we are seeing these on lower quality security camera footage. Given the quick cuts here, it's important to make it so that we can't miss Ross on the footage, and I'm in awe of how easy it is to catch him here. Couple that with how easy it is to keep track of characters on the ground level when we cut back to Bourne and Ross, and I hope you can see why I wish more action films would look closer at how this film uses its techniques to perfection. The shaky cam unfortunately has crept its way over into more of the dialogue sequences, and it's really distracting. Why does the camera need to keep moving when Jason is telling Martin about Marie's death? It doesn't make me feel like I'm in the room with them, it makes me worried that the camera operator is going to drop it. It takes away a bit from the emotion of the moment for me. I do have plenty of other nice things to say about this film, which shouldn't be that surprising at this point. There is a moment between Nikki and Jason where she admits that her desire to help comes from a personal history with Bourne. The dialogue is ambiguous enough that you could interpret it in a few ways. I think she's talking about a past relationship between the two, but I was never a fan of this idea, especially given Marie's overshadowing presence in these films, and that I don't think Bourne would have been open to something like that in the past. It's not really a problem, and it's just a personal preference, so I like that I could interpret this in another way. That Nikki's knowledge of Bourne's history and seeing how he was being used was something that she wrestled with hard while working under Conklin. Just offering an alternative if you're like me and don't like the relationship angle. Given that Supremacy wasn't designed with a sequel in mind, I love how the crew repurposed the ending of that film to be a crucial moment in the third act here. There, it was meant to reveal Bourne's real name of David Webb, acting as a reward for all of Bourne's struggles to redeem himself. Here, the key bit of info for the audience is shifted to be his birth date, which reveals the address of the training facility where Albert Hirsch is. Such a great example of how to retcon a scene without destroying its purpose in either film. Finally, the film ends with Bourne in the water, much as the first film started. Each of the first 3 films' endings are interesting to compare with each other, and how each will tie into its respective films' themes. In Identity, Jason settles down with Marie off the grid, allowing him to live a life of his choosing. In Supremacy, Bourne disappears into the crowd, symbolizing how he's becoming more of a real person like everyone else on that street. In Ultimatum, we see Bourne disappearing into nothing. Unlike a traditional hero's end of riding off into the sunset, Bourne becomes invisible. He's not a traditional action hero, he's a reluctant one. He never immediately jumps at the call to action, but there's an innate sense of duty to the truth that compels him to come back out into the limelight to right the wrongs. So it makes sense that he doesn't get the same sort of heroic fanfare like Indiana Jones would. There are so many wonderful touches and elements that make the Bourne Ultimatum a stunning success. If you want to enjoy it on a pure action level, you will be treated to one of the finest action films of the 2000s. If you enjoy the political commentary, you'll get a stark reminder that not everyone in power is fit to rule. If you enjoy Bourne as a character, you get to see the culmination of a 3-film arc that wonderfully builds on top of each other. The mark of a stellar movie to me is when it works on multiple levels. Every time I come back to this film, I get something new out of the experience. Or I get a refreshing reminder about something I loved about it before. If this was to be the last time we see Bourne, this was probably the best possible place we could have ended that journey. However, leaving an audience wanting more can often lead to film companies acquiescing to that desire, and risks diluting the franchise into another run-of-the-mill choice amongst its genre. While the 3 original Bourne films thoroughly covered that man's story for now, there were clearly surrounding events and characters that could be mined for further adventures. Tony Gilroy, a key component in the success of the first 2 films, was enticed to come back as he wanted to expand on that universe and tell a different story without Matt Damon and Paul Greengrass. Upon rewatching the Bourne Ultimatum, Tony contacted his brother Dan Gilroy about potentially doing a sidequel. Unlike a prequel or a sequel, a sidequel happens at the same time as another adventure and tells a different story. The ending of Ultimatum had serious repercussions that could be dealt with in an exciting way. Originally contracted for 2 weeks' work, Tony Gilroy helped to develop a new character called Aaron Cross, and eventually chose to direct the film himself. The Bourne Legacy, the first in the series without the presence of Jason Bourne, was released in 2012 and offered a unique look into the Bourne universe and how he impacted the lives of other characters. The film opens during the events of Ultimatum. As Bourne's journey progresses from the death of Simon Ross to the exposure of Treadstone and Blackbriar, the government's wheels are turning, looking to head off the fire before it spreads and consumes other top-secret programs. Colonel Eric Brier discovers a potential link that could be made between Treadstone and another program called Outcome. Brier orders for Outcome to be shut down and all of its agents to be eliminated. One of them, Aaron Cross, is in Alaska undergoing a survival exercise as punishment for going AWOL on a previous assignment. He narrowly escapes termination, tricking Brier's team into believing he is dead. Outcome involves chemical stimulation and enhancement of the agents, and Cross is running low on his stash of pills. So he goes to find the sole surviving doctor of the program, Dr. Marta Shearing, to find more. Shearing reveals that his physical enhancements were made permanent, so there's no need for those. But his mental enhancements are still dependent on the pills, which she doesn't have. The two set off to try to find a solution to Cross's problem, while also evading Brier's team, who are looking to finish the job and tie up all loose ends to Outcome. The Bourne Legacy has several intriguing things going for it. Tony Gilroy was just coming off of films like Michael Clayton and State of Play, so he had been honing his craft and had even expanded to directing. Jeremy Renner was an actor that was gaining quite the traction at the time and had a similar vibe to Matt Damon, someone who looked like a relatable everyman who could pull off a believable tough guy persona. The cast has some great names surrounding it. Along with several people returning from Ultimatum, it also starred Edward Norton, Oscar Isaac, and Rachel Weisz. Instead of covering yet another exposure of a Black Ops program, this is about a man looking to survive and not targeting the government throughout. So automatically the focus has been shifted, and this can have a unique identity apart from the Bourne trilogy. This all sounds well and good. So why am I not a fan of this one? Don't get me wrong, it's a competent film on a technical and performance level. Everyone is doing a good job, particularly Vice. The action scenes have the right sense of groundedness about them. The story starts off strong, examining the fallout of Ultimatum and comparing it to an infection that will spread and compromise other government programs, which is a logical continuation from the earlier films. And the final action scene rivals a lot of the scenes from the original films. However, I always feel bored for part of the film, and so I have to rewind it to make sure I didn't miss anything. There are also several nagging issues I can't overlook, and thus, while I also have some strong criticism for the next film in the franchise, this is the one I'm the least likely to want to rewatch. First, I don't find Cross to be that interesting. While he does have special conditioning and training like Bourne did so as to sell me on him being a credible action hero, I'm also not seeing a real personal conflict here. Cross wants to run away and heal. Not an unsympathetic goal, but I'm also not seeing a lot that's proactive or unique about him. Running to save your own skin is not a character trait, it's what most anybody would do. If I knew I was dying from a poison and there was an antidote on the other side of the country, you wouldn't consider me brave or noteworthy for setting off to get it. Cross wants to overcome a dependence on drugs. Again, understandable, but I want to see more here. Where's the difficult choice he has to make? Where's that moment of growth? As put forth wonderfully by Geekvolution's Captain Logan when discussing story structure, a lot of them share key elements. A protagonist that has a goal, faces obstacles to get it, and has an opportunity for change. The opportunity for change is crucial because we learn something about the character based on whether or not he makes that choice. For example, Luke Skywalker is given the opportunity to join the dark side and gain his father back in The Empire Strikes Back. However, he refuses Vader's offer, and thus Luke demonstrates an ability to reject power, a test his father failed. In Casablanca, Rick is given a choice to live with either Ilsa or to have her go off with Victor Laszlo. He chooses the latter, and thus demonstrates his ability to see the larger picture and his willingness to sacrifice his own happiness for the sake of something greater. I'm not saying anything like that for Cross, and so watching him is an empty experience for me. I do see these elements in Marta's story, and it makes me feel like she should have been the focus of the film. The clear moments of doubt I see that Cross had happened before the start of the film, like when he accidentally killed some people on a mission, or when he went AWOL. So the interesting material has already happened, and we are watching a man after he went through his moment of change. That's not a story to me, that's a reaction. And watching a reaction without experiencing the moment with the protagonist leaves a personal story feeling hollow or missing. Second, I think the story takes too long to get going. While there is a fair amount to cover involving the initial setup of the exposure of the government programs by Bourne, we are also intercutting with scenes of Cross going on his survival course and meeting up with Oscar Isaac's character. It's 30 minutes in before Cross sets out on his own quest, which directly influences the direction of the story. And so it feels like I've just watched 30 minutes of background material before the actual story starts. It's a pacing choice that has always bugged me, because it's during this first act that I have the hardest time paying attention. Third, and I don't know that I've ever had cause to complain about this before, but the movie just ends without much of a resolution. Cross and Shearing decide to get lost, and that's it. There seems to be no lasting consequences for Breyer and his team for failing to capture Cross or deciding to send out a Larks agent, a super soldier from a program that seems to be so off the books that key people in the CIA don't know about it. It ends a bit like Identity in that our two leads are going off to have a life. However, that seems foolhardy since they have no guarantee Breyer won't find them again. Sure, the last lead they had didn't pan out, but Breyer and crew are still in play, and I didn't catch any indication that they thought Cross and Shearing are dead, so I doubt Breyer considers the matter closed. Plus, it's an odd choice to have Landy potentially indicted for the leak. Vosen lies to the committee about the purpose of Blackbriar and shifts the spotlight on who did the most wrong to her, so it makes it seem like the bad guys are winning this time. I'm just not sure what to make of this whole ending. I suppose if a sequel were planned, that could have helped clear this ending up, and there was supposed to be one until development of a fourth film with Damon preempted those plans, but I still question the wisdom of writing a story that's only half finished. Even in an established and successful franchise, there was never a guarantee of getting a part 2 to a specific story, and back in 2012, reboots and continuation films that practically ignored certain entries had happened several times before. I think in this case, it would have been better to treat the franchise like the Dark Knight trilogy, or the Godfather trilogy, or the Oceans trilogy. Make each one a complete experience that didn't need sequels to finish the story. Especially since the filmmakers were taking quite the risk with having Jeremy Renner headline a Bourne film, they should have been a bit less concerned with the future and more focused on just finishing their story for the here and now. Tony Gilroy was a key figure in the success of the franchise before now, and I would hope that with a Best Picture nominated film under his belt since the last time we saw his work in a Bourne film, this would result in a tighter picture that could live up to the first three. Except it doesn't. I'm honestly a little baffled that some of the mistakes happened here with such a proven talent at the wheel. As I've said, the cast is really solid. Renner is a fine choice for a leading man, and he's proven himself in plenty of roles before now. I've always been a fan of Rachel Weisz, and I think this is one of her more overlooked roles. She does a fantastic job portraying a character caught in a hurricane of crazy, and yet doesn't seem like a bumbling idiot who just tags along for the ride to look hot. Edward Norton does what he can with a fairly colorless role, and I appreciate it. There are even a couple of additional cast members of note, including Oscar Isaac, who had had a few solid roles by now, but who would become an even bigger face after starring in The Force Awakens, and Corey Stoll makes a small contribution, just before he went on to play an important character in the American version of House of Cards, and then took the role of everybody's favorite villain in the MCU, Yellow Jacket, who later became MODOK. There is one other bit that I like. In a flashback, Breyer tells Cross that they are sin-eaters, doing the morally indefensible so that other souls may remain clean. Given how the series is following people who gave up their humanity, this is an interesting notion. How do the people justify the bad things they do in the line of duty? And are those answers enough to quell your conscience? In Mass Effect 2, Thane Krios justifies his life as an assassin by thinking of himself as a weapon. He is not the one committing the deed. He is the tool another uses, and if there is a sin in the act, the responsibility lies on their head. However, Thane struggles with this viewpoint, as the eidetic memory of his species makes it so that he can't forget the acts, and they still weigh on him. For Bourne and Cross, we don't see them as they are involved in the bloody business, but we can surmise from both of their actions that they have decided the answers to justify these acts aren't sufficient. Both possess enough of a soul to not consider themselves a machine and decide that the only path to redemption must take them away from their respective programs. I do wish we spent more time with Cross to feel his struggle with this, but we have enough info and see his actions to surmise some points about him. And I love that the question is brought up to Marta in reference to controlling people through pills, and she can only respond that she did it for her country. This film, in conjunction with the rest of the series, does make you think about the moral justifications we make in order to live with ourselves, and I appreciate that. I think the Bourne Legacy is playing tug of war with itself. Doing another story in the universe with a new character makes a lot of sense. You have talented people working behind the camera, and you have wonderful actors that have proven that they are worth their high salaries. However, the film constantly lives in the shadow of the previous films. All throughout, we hear mention of Bourne and his actions, how the fire he created is spreading into this story. It's hard not to want him back in the film when we are introduced to a set of characters that are less interesting, and a story that doesn't seem to know where it wants to go and what points it wants to make. This may be a case of a sequel trying to be different for the sake of being different, trying to open the doors for the franchise to tell new kinds of stories. The issue is, I'm getting the feeling that not much thought went into exactly what they wanted to do, and how they were going to create something just as interesting and meaningful as before. It's like buying a kid who is interested in making films a 4K camera, a lot of the state-of-the-art equipment, hiring some experienced crew members, and renting a studio space. Sure, now you have the freedom to make whatever you want, but unless you have a vision for what you want to do, it's all meaningless. I applaud the filmmakers for not feeling like they had to just do a lesser Bourne film. The trouble is that in their desire to do something different, the new stuff just isn't that interesting, and what they do pull off feels like a pale imitation of what was done before. I don't hate the Bourne Legacy, I'm just not that interested in revisiting it much. It's painfully average more than anything, which leads me to forget it even exists for long stretches of time. In spite of the mixed reception of the Bourne Legacy, or maybe because of it, Universal was still interested in making more films. A sequel was in the works, featuring Aaron Cross and continuing his story. However, Matt Damon expressed interest in coming back, along with Paul Greengrass. They had both initially felt like they had exhausted themselves with the series after Ultimatum, but over time, they felt like they had more to offer. This immediately took priority over the Legacy sequel, given that the public was going to be more interested in Damon's return than Renner's. Sadly, this meant that a Legacy sequel was shelved for the time being, and as of the time of this recording, there's no indication there will ever be one. The fifth film, titled Jason Bourne, would do more than reunite Damon and Greengrass. It would attempt to continue exploring Bourne's character after he no longer had amnesia. It would show a critical moment in his past and reveal that Treadstone's roots go much deeper into darker territory than anyone suspected, allowing us to see the actual mind of the program, who is being played by Tommy Lee Jones. Julia Stiles would return as Nikki Parsons, who had a crucial role in bringing Bourne back into the limelight. It would also feature a new character named Heather Lee, played by Alicia Vikander, an ambitious officer who has her own agenda. It would also modernize Bourne's world, dealing with the ever-growing problem of increased surveillance and how openly we as a society are giving up our privacy in favor of security. A notion that the Bourne films never really tackled before, but that seems right in line with the conflicts and commentary of the original films. Everything seemed in place for a comeback that would put the series on top. 12 years after the exposure of Treadstone and Blackbriar, Jason Bourne continues living off the grid, having fully received his memory back and trying to make a go of things. Meanwhile, Nikki Parsons hacks into the CIA servers, finding more of the Black Ops programs, and uncovering important information about Bourne's recruitment into Treadstone and how his father was involved. Cybersecurity head Heather Lee is quickly tasked by CIA Director Robert Dewey with hunting down Parsons and the leaked files. Parsons contacts Bourne, trying to recruit him to her cause, but before the two can make any progress, Parsons is killed by an assassin with a grudge and a history with Bourne. Bourne takes up the cause, working his way through the files and discovering that his father was a key figure in Treadstone's creation, who threatened to expose the program when his son was recruited and was killed by Parsons' assassin under orders from Dewey. Now with a personal stake in the mission, and on the eve of a merger with the CIA and a social media network that will result in mass surveillance of America, Bourne must finish the fight with Dewey and close the doors on his past with the agency for good. Jason Bourne feels like a course correction. We've seen this many times in other franchises now, but more often than not, these kinds of corrections can feel short-sighted and result in more middling entries. The film ultimately fared about as well critically as the Bourne Legacy, so it didn't seem to confirm that the lack of Bourne himself was the answer as to why Legacy got a mixed reaction. I certainly think it contributes to that film's missteps, but I don't think it follows that the answer is to get Greengrass and Damon back. So while this entry certainly feels closer to what I want from another Bourne film, the franchise seems to be treading through old ground here without making it fresh or as interesting as the previous films. I think there are three big problems that dilute the film: Dewey's presence, the choice to include Bourne's father in the creation of Treadstone, and the social media angle. Let's tackle this first issue. With Ultimatum, I felt like we had progressed to the logical end person in the chain. We had dealt with Bourne's superior, the superior to the superior, and finally the man who recruited Bourne into the program, as well as the man who ran the successor to Treadstone. Did we really need to go all the way to the head of the CIA and personally connect him to Bourne? Sure, the series always showed that various aspects of the agency were corrupt, and previous director Ezra Kramer was under investigation due to the exposure of Blackbriar. I have no doubt that this infection goes all the way to the upper levels of the CIA, but making the head of the CIA the villain seems one step too far in order to retroactively make Dewey an important figure in Bourne's history and an even bigger threat than anyone that he's taken down prior. It feels like a cartoony case of always having one more looming mastermind behind the mastermind. You thought you knew it all, but there's more to the story and an even bigger boss you have to defeat. You can only do that twist so many times before it feels ridiculous. Bringing Bourne's dad into the story isn't inherently a bad idea, but the problem is twofold. It's a retcon that comes dangerously close to full-blown revisionism, and it brings a silly degree of fate into David Webb's beginning as Bourne, since the program targeted Webb for recruitment. Instead of Bourne making a decisive choice of his own accord, it recolors it to be a result of master manipulation, which weakens the impact of that decision. It doesn't erase it, but it does recontextualize the original films. Instead of the Bourne series being about a man who committed past sins and is looking for atonement, this makes the series about a man who was wrongfully controlled by the government and fated to become a living weapon. That notion was certainly suggested in the previous films, but never definitively answered, and it was more about people making sacrifices of their own humanity in the service of their country rather than them being controlled by the government before that point. This might be more of a personal disagreement with this film's retcon rather than an actual problem, as in another context, I'd be fine with exploring the ramifications of a government thinking of the people as tools. And again, there is some of that in the original films and Legacy. But it does matter where the manipulation starts in Bourne's story. If you read the original films as I did, this kind of wrecks all of that. Plus, having everything come together so neatly with David Webb at the center, his father having created the program, Dewey ordering his father's death, and having the same asset with a personal grudge here be the one who did the actual deed, pushes this all into a degree of unreality that is starting to verge into comic book film levels of coincidence. It's similar to the problems I have with making the Joker the killer of Batman's parents in the original Tim Burton film, or Peter Parker's father being the creator of the spider venom that gives him powers in The Amazing Spider-Man. It's too convenient for me to suspend my disbelief. I don't mind a sense of poetic finish, making seemingly disparate things come together so that the character is at the most crucial point of his life now, but you have to do this and have it all come together in a more subtle and natural way if you want to do it in a Bourne film. One of these things happening would be fine. 2 is passable. 3 is too much for me. The commentary about social media and how that transforms our world doesn't really go anywhere, and Bourne's mission has very little to do with stopping the merger, so it feels tacked on. In my review of Tomorrow Never Dies, I talked about the inclusion of a media mogul and how that felt timely. Some people made a valid point in the comments section that their problem with it was that the commentary that could have been made about it didn't go anywhere, and the idea of media manipulation was employed by both the main villain and the head of MI6 in the story, resulting in a mixed message. Here, Riz Ahmed doesn't actually get to reveal the big secret by the end of the film, meaning that the film itself doesn't seem to deliver a resolution to that dilemma or some final thought, which makes the whole angle inclusion seem odd. And the fact that this clear violation of the law by the CIA for the sake of protection doesn't have any relevance on Bourne or his goals doubly makes this pointless. Bourne is usually about uncovering these programs because he's a patriot at heart, a hero that can't ignore threats both foreign and domestic. So why not have Bourne become aware of this and have him uncover the merger? The argument could be made that we've done this twice before already in the other films, so it was done this way for the sake of avoiding repetition. Okay. But then why isn't it dealt in a more permanent way by the end of the film with someone else? I suppose this could be another case of the filmmakers planning a sequel before it was confirmed, but I'll refer you back to my comments about this when Legacy did the same thing. It's unsatisfying and a huge risk in case you don't get a sequel to leave a key part of the story out for a potential follow-up. The cast is all doing a fine job. Damon can play Bourne in his sleep at this point. Julia Stiles is a welcome reprise. Series newcomers Tommy Lee Jones and Alicia Vikander both do justice to their roles. I think Jones has a better handle on his character than the script seems to, so my problems with him have nothing to do with his interpretation. Alicia Vikander is an actress I'm always interested in, ever since her role in Ex Machina, and Leah's probably my favorite new character here. Riz Ahmed plays Aaron Kalor, in yet another role in a big blockbuster that doesn't fully utilize his talents. Vincent Cassel gets the opportunity to play an opposing assassin who finally has an actual character in this series. While I question his role in the story, I'm always happy to see him in a film, even if it did jump out to me that this is the second time I've seen him and Damon against each other in a film in Vegas. With Greengrass returning, along with editor Christopher Roos, you might be worried that the shaky cam and quick editing return. While they do, it's far more subdued and doesn't interfere with the viewing as much as it tended to do with earlier entries. In fact, the production here feels closer in spirit to Identity than the others, and for the first 30 minutes of the movie, I'm as invested here as I was there. The plaza sequence with Parsons and Bourne feels very much like it belongs in one of the earlier movies. Other things I like include a brief reference to Outcome and Larks, making it very clear that Legacy hasn't entirely been forgotten. The agency never treating the return of Bourne as a minor nuisance is a good repeat from earlier movies. In other films, the reappearance of a hero is often downplayed with a villain or their organization, despite that hero constantly foiling their plans. Bourne is responsible for one of the biggest security leaks and is known to be a dangerous rogue element, so I like that everyone at the agency immediately sits up when Bourne comes back into the game, even if it is over 10 years later. And I love that final scene with Vikander and Damon, along with the twist that Bourne knows about Lee's ambitions and isn't likely to be won over by her. I do have one more minor complaint, which is probably a personal gripe: the title. You know how book lovers and collectors get mad when the spines don't match up in design or size on their shelves? Now, I get not naming the film The Bourne Betrayal, the 5th in the book series, as no one is really betraying anyone here. But why not come up with another name that keeps it in line with the other films? Like The Bourne Reemergence, The Bourne Revelation, or something. I'm not that great with titles. Calling the film just Jason Bourne feels lazy, as the film is no more a personal story than some of the others, and reminds me of one of my least favorite naming trends in Hollywood right now. I feel like titles should feel distinct and not create confusion. For example, James Gunn calling his film Superman after we've already had a Superman the movie. J.J. Abrams calling his film Star Trek when that's the name of the original series. Or Sony calling the 2016 reboot of Ghostbusters simply Ghostbusters. It's really irritating to me and creates confusion when I want to talk about this movie with somebody because I have to make it clear which one I'm talking about beyond saying the title. At least there are no other films called Jason Bourne, but still. I do enjoy Jason Bourne more than the Bourne Legacy. However, some of the story points here are the most questionable of the franchise, and I find myself feeling a little tired of the character. Sure, we've had 3 previous films with him, and another that was the result of his actions, so it might be natural that I'm feeling burnt out by the 5th film. But I don't feel like it's the number of entries that's the problem. I can sit through 25 official James Bond films and still get excited about the prospect of another one afterwards. Mission Impossible has had 7 entries so far, and I'm fully on board for the 8th. My problem is that Bourne is being treated as an actual character that undergoes an arc, and when one film contains a fairly definitive final statement on the character, and you decide to tack on another chapter, it starts to feel like the franchise doesn't know when to leave the party. Ultimatum did such a good job of feeling like it had covered everything with Bourne that I wasn't too sad at the prospect of never seeing him again. When Bourne walks off towards the Washington Monument here, I'm kinda hoping this is the last time we'll see the man. And so far we've gone 8 years without another installment in the series, so I may get my wish after all. It's not that Jason Bourne killed the franchise for me. I would just hate it to devolve into yet another routine franchise that churns out installment after installment in a universe that wasn't built to support an ongoing conveyor belt of stories for the character. When I started writing this video, I felt like I wasn't going to have much to say, so I considered condensing it down to a simple ranking. However, it turns out rewatching the series gave me a lot to think about, and there are plenty of topics I didn't even really touch on, such as the comparisons between the books and the films, delving into the political commentary of each, spending much time with the production history, the religious subtext of the character's journey, and examining the impact of the first 3 films on pop culture and action movies in the 2000s. Today, the Bourne franchise isn't talked about as much, and at times it feels like it's weirdly faded into nothing, much as Bourne does at the end of each film. In a way that feels appropriate, as those initial films weren't trying to be pioneers or prophets preaching the coming future of the action genre. They were just trying to tell good stories focusing on a damaged man and developing techniques to push action films forward. I'm not sure they are truly forgotten, as when people still talk about the action genre, this original trilogy still comes up, and you can feel the influences of these in a lot of action pieces today. When I watch a Bourne film, I'm not thinking about anything more than what I'm watching, and that's a testament as to how effective they are. They're just darn good action films that have some heart to them and seek to give you a wildly fun ride. I do have a clear pegging order for this series, but even with the lesser ones, I don't feel like the series ever got to the point where it became a hiss and a byword. As such, it's one of the more consistent action franchises of the last 30 years, and I hope that people never truly forget the time they spent with the amnesiac agent that was once Jason Bourne.